amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello and welcome, listeners. My guest today is Lauren Russell, Secretary at Australian Tiny House Association. Tiny houses have been a passion of mine for many, many years, and I was fascinated when I discovered that Lauren, who I've known for many years, was secretary of this association, which recognises that tiny houses take many shapes and sizes and are either fixed or movable. Australian Tiny House Association, since inception, was focused on movable tiny houses on wheels, THOW, T-H-O-W, and skids, T-H-O-S, and advocates for legalising the living in tiny houses in Australia. All positions are filled by volunteers, helping with their mission to have tiny living understood and accepted across Australia, so that more people have the option to live in this sustainable and more affordable housing type. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you very much, Rosemary.
Now, before we begin, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear a little bit about you, where you were born and brought up, and then later we'll go on to how you got involved here.
Okay, well, I'll try not to talk too long in this section then, but I'm always been a Queenslander, always lived in Queensland, apart from a year that I did overseas on exchange. Grew up, did my high school in Toowoomba and went to university, studied electrical engineering. And then I've worked in a bauxite mine in far north Queensland, Weipa, and lived and worked in Boyne Island at the smelter there, aluminium smelter. Right. So, but now I'm back in Toowoomba, and I've got my electrical engineering background, and I've done some further study around civil infrastructure and business.
Gosh, so you're well qualified in the position that you hold here. But so tell me now, how did you first get involved with the Australian Tiny Homes Association?
I think it's hard to pinpoint it, but I've always been in. We did, my family and I, my husband and 3 children, did travel in a caravan for about 8 or 9 months back in 2009, and we've lived in a lot of houses, small houses and big houses, and my husband is a real boat person, so yes. We do have a small boat that you could live on, one that lives in the water, and you could live on, 2 people could live on. So we've often talked about doing that in future, and I think just through connections in Toowoomba, I've seen people struggle to find somewhere to live, and just the idea. It's a bit of a novelty, tiny houses. It comes across your feed, your Facebook feed, or your YouTube. There's lots of exciting ideas out there, and architecture in general has interested me. Yep. So I think it's a lot of little things coming together.
Absolutely. And one of your aims is to advocate and work towards the understanding and acceptance of tiny houses across all levels of government. So how do you sort of go about doing that?
Well, at the moment, tiny houses aren't recognised as a housing typology. Caravans are something that's recognised, even though they're not regulated by building standards. Yes. They're vehicles. And the Building Code of Australia doesn't recognise tiny houses because they're on wheels. So we're kind of in this area, wheels or skids. But we're kind of in this area that everyone's aware of it, but it doesn't fit anywhere. So people look at them and categorise them either as caravans or as homes, just depending on lots of different reasons.
Right. And at the moment, as in a lot of countries, of course, housing affordability is in real crisis, isn't it? Affecting the parts of Australia, particularly in regional, rural and city locations. And additionally, there's an increased need for environmentally responsible housing options. So, I mean, it really is an option, isn't it?
It should be.
Yes.
It should be. At the moment, with the unknowns, it's not an easy path, and there are some challenges when you decide to live in a tiny house, and different local government areas have different rules, different states have different rules, and those rules were often written without thinking of tiny houses. So they're not necessarily ruling them out, but they're not ruling them in. And so individuals have to be ready to have lots of discussions with government if that's the way they really want to live. And not everyone has the luxury of years to spend discussing their particular project when affordability is is in the mix.
Exactly. Now, tiny homes is different to tiny houses, isn't it? Is that right? I think I watched a television program an English television program on tiny homes or tiny spaces or something.
The words, a lot of people use them interchangeably.
Yes.
I personally think of tiny homes as a much broader term. So, a caravan could be a tiny home or a yurt or a converted bus or a shipping container. They could all be tiny homes potentially.
Right.
But when we're talking tiny houses, especially the Australian Tiny House Association, we have limited our remit to houses that are movable, that are on skids or on wheels, like you mentioned before, and probably less than around 50 square metres.
Right.
So that excludes, even though we are still supportive of a lot of other tiny homes, it excludes things like permanent granny flats or other permanent structures that really do fit in the Building Code of Australia's definition of dwellings. So we are, we've chosen our our area of expertise and focus.
Exactly. Now, you gather and provide information regarding the building and living in tiny houses in Australia. I mean, again, how do you sort of go about doing that?
We have had a number of passionate people as part of the Australian Tiny House Association over the years since it was started, I think, in 2018. We've had architects and builders and people who want to live tiny and lots of different people. So those as volunteers, they're putting their skills together and developing resources like guides to building safely. That's a lot of concern for a lot of people that if we allowed tiny houses to be a real accepted thing, how do we keep control of the safety of these houses? We obviously want the people living in them to be safe. So we need these guidelines, and we have a lot of draft guidelines, construction standards on our website, and a lot of resources that anyone who's thinking they'd like to live tiny can have a look at. There's still some unknowns, absolutely.
Yes.
And it's still a process, but being educated before you go and buy a tiny home or build a tiny home about the potential challenges you might face is really important.
Right, exactly. I wonder how many people do live in tiny homes now at the moment. I mean, do you think it is a growing industry?
It absolutely is a growing industry, but we don't know numbers because often the people who are living tiny don't broadcast it because they are in this grey area of whether they're actually living in an approved way. So many people are not sharing addresses, not sharing. There's lots of, if you discussions on Facebook, for instance, there's lots of people considering it or doing it, but it's not a question on the regular census paper.
But I think it will become more and more popular, won't it, as housing becomes scarcer and scarcer.
There's more and more builders deciding to start building tiny, so I think that's a really good indication that there is a market, that people are asking for it. So, and more builders are seeing that the affordability, the current housing crisis needs a solution, needs people to be thinking differently. And tiny houses, an investment in a tiny house is, because we're not talking a land component, is so much more affordable for everyone.
Can I just clarify? Now, a tiny house that's on wheels, it doesn't need to have council approval, is that right, or it does?
It needs to meet the vehicle standards usually.
Right.
But different local government areas have different rules around how long you can live in a tiny house or caravan on private property.
Right.
So in Brisbane, I believe there's been precedents set where you can live in a tiny house and wheels in a backyard in Brisbane, I believe. Obviously, things are always changing, so don't take that as gospel.
Right.
But in Toowoomba, where I live, there is a rule that you can only live in a caravan or tiny house in a backyard for up to 60 days in a year. So someone deciding to do it in Toowoomba is doing it with the risk that they might be asked to move on.
Can you up and wheel it somewhere else?
Wheel it up and somewhere else. So maybe if you've got a few different options and
Yes.
and you're willing to keep moving it.
Yes.
But tiny houses, even though they're built on wheels,
Yes.
they're built of traditional materials.
Right.
So they're not meant to be moved all the time. If you're going to move all the time, you'd get a caravan.
Yes.
So these are designed to be moved maybe within 24 hours of
Yes.
being able to disconnect a few things, but
Not
but
like
not
to
a
get
regular.
stuck on the highway behind a huge group of tiny houses on the move.
That's right. People who want to move should be in a caravan or something like that.
Exactly. Now, you aim to promote a sort of healthy social and community environment conducive to tiny house building and dwelling. That's part of your function as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. The people attracted to tiny house living, we've found there are three reasons people are attracted to tiny houses in general. One of them is a potential to make money, with maybe an Airbnb kind of situation where you might put in your backyard and rent it out either short term or longer term. So that's probably a third of the market. Then there are the people who are interested in reducing their environmental footprint. If with a smaller dwelling, there's less materials, less heating and cooling costs, less of everything. So they're having a less of an impact on the planet.
Right.
And then there's the final third are the people who would like to have the opportunity to own what they're living in.
Yes.
Even if they have to rent the land from somebody in somebody's backyard, but being able to even if you have to borrow and pay off over, say, 5 or 7 years, a dwelling that is yours, that you can decorate the way you want. You don't have landlords inspecting for holes in walls, etc. The dignity that comes with living in something, even if it's very modest, can't be understated.
Exactly, and you're, as you say, you're your own landlord. You can't be asked to leave in a second because they want to sell or whatever. So yes, you're
right.
self-sufficient, aren't you?
And if you're, say, a 55-year-old single person and you park it in the backyard of your grown-up son's house, for instance, and he gets transferred with work and needs to sell his house and move, you still have your house. Yes, you need to find another place to park it, but it's not the same as if you had put money into his mortgage to build a granny flat, and then he has to sell, and then you have to work out what part of the funds that come in do you get back, and that kind of complication can be avoided.
It is actually. I totally agree, because it can be a problem, isn't it? Particularly people that do go in with a mortgage with their children and build a granny flat or a sort of small house there or whatever, and then one of the parties needs to sell, or even the person who's built it needs to go into a nursing home and leaves that as a problem for the other people to carry the whole mortgage. So yes, there are numerous advantages. Now, you network with related, as you say, government agencies, educational institutions, development organisations, and private industry to address these stated purposes. I mean, is that hard? Do you get a blank wall, or do you get a good reception, or what?
We often, people are keen to help solve the problem, but they're often hampered by existing regulations, existing ways we do things. For example, the federal government has a lot of ideas, and the state government, a lot of ideas about how they can address the housing crisis, and they're putting money in social housing and other community housing, affordable housing. But all of those are, to me, they're part of the solution, but it doesn't help. A lot of our people who are struggling with affordability are full-time employed.
Right.
They're not looking, they don't qualify for social housing or affordable housing because they earn too much, but they also don't have the rents are huge at the moment, as everybody knows.
Yes.
The rents are huge. The cost of buying a house so high, and
Well, even if you're, given a loan, but the problem is that a lot of people aren't given the opportunity to have a loan, are they? Because they haven't got enough deposit or
that's
whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess that the governments are keen to chat, but not sure if it's in their area. Even the local governments, you talk to them about planning.
Yes.
And houses on wheels don't really fit in their land use constraints because it's a vehicle as far as they're concerned.
Right.
So it really doesn't easily fit into anybody's category.
Yes.
So even though we have meetings and things
Yes.
a lot of things have to change. It seems from my experience is when there's a champion within an organisation. So
Exactly.
over in Esperance in WA, we have one of our tiny house champions, which we have a number of listed on our website. They're people in industry who support tiny house living. We have someone over there in Esperance who works within council and has done wonders in sharing the information and developing policies so people can live in Esperance within local government laws in their tiny houses. And
terrific.
Usually there's probably maybe one in each state that is leading the way, but we've got over 500, I think, local government areas in Australia, so it would be great if the state governments took the lead or the federal government took the lead so that there was consistency between local government areas.
Exactly. That would be wonderful. Now, you're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is Lauren Russell, Secretary of the Australian Tiny House Association. Now, Lauren, you fundraise to support your activities. How do you go about doing that?
We have a membership. Program. So individuals, $50 a year, businesses, $130 a year. So not a lot.
Yes.
And that money comes in to help us develop these resources, to help us have a website, and we represent the association. There are these expos called Tiny Home Expos that's run by a private company. It's not run by the Australian Tiny House Association, but we always have a stall there and share our information and tell everyone where the resources are, and we usually provide a speaker to talk about what we know and what we are. So that's the fundraising is through membership at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's terrific, and I'll give out all the details afterwards as how people can contact you and join up if they wish. Now, similar to Australia, Ireland is also having a very serious housing crisis due to many factors, including a lack of social and affordable housing, and of course crippling rental costs. I believe they're proposing a 2-year pilot program that would allow mobile tiny homes installed by homeowners on their own land without the need for planning permission. To be used as rental accommodation for short, medium and long term. Now, particularly, which I think is really important, particularly for key workers coming into communities and needing housing for them, like nurses and even in the hospitality industry. I mean, how many restaurants and coffee shops do you go in? And actually, particularly in Hobart, where I've just been again, and there's not enough staff. And they say, well, we can't get the staff because they can't find anywhere affordable to live, sort of close by. So what do you think of Ireland's proposition?
I think it's brilliant. I think a lot of jurisdictions are maybe afraid that if they open the door up a little bit to tiny houses, then things might get out of hand, and we'll end up with trailer parks or slum-like environments. But with some guidelines or with some rules around it, I really do think that can be avoided. And trials are a brilliant way of helping others who don't know, who are a little bit hesitant about tiny house living, to see how the impact will go on the rest of the community. Yes. And you just mentioned Hobart and Toowoomba, like where I'm from as well. What you said about people not having anywhere to live, the key workers not having anywhere to live. A few years ago, I did hear that Toowoomba nurses or medical people were accepting jobs, but then having to to give them away again because they couldn't find anywhere to stay in Toowoomba.
Right.
And a lot of companies in Toowoomba who are trying to attract workers, they will buy up houses so that they've got places for their workers that move to town. But of course, that's got the flow-on effect of less houses being available for others.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And then, of course, there's the Airbnb, which has taken up so many of the houses, particularly in inner city areas like Battery Point or Sandy Bay in Hobart. Actually, I was over in Strahan, which is right over on the west coast of Tasmania, and talking to some of the staff there that worked in a restaurant, and they said exactly like you that they had built accommodation for their staff, which so that they can be on site, which is very, very important. Now, you've been quoted as saying tiny homes open home ownership to the wider population, including younger singles, older singles, couples, and even families, and do, low-cost alternative to traditional housing. And, of course, they probably make, as we've sort of mentioned a bit before, but they do probably make the ideal granny flat. I mean, quite frankly, I'd rather like a nice sort of granny flat, and I'm not sure if my daughters would like me in their back garden in a granny flat, but never mind.
You do need to be a little bit selective about who you're opening up your backyard to. I think you want to make sure that they complement your life.
Yeah.
But I've spoken to people. I've got a 21-year-old son, and he's an apprentice, and so he lives at home because it's cheap rent. But he would love to be a little bit more independent. And if he could live in, he could, with his apprentice wage, could buy one of these and pay it off over 4 or 5 years and have it in our backyard and be quite independent. And then when he finishes his apprenticeship and whatever he does next, he could either sell it to the next 18-year-old to do the same thing or and take that money as a deposit to buy a traditional house, potentially, wherever he was going next. Yeah. Similarly, I've spoken to a lady who came up to me at one of the at one of the expos, actually, and she said she has 3 teenagers with special needs, and she is worried about what the next step will be for them when they become more independent. And she said it would be perfect for her to be able to put a tiny house in the backyard, let them learn to live independently while she's only, 10 metres away. So it would really help their family deal with the transition of the younger kids becoming independent. So there's veterans that could really better benefit from tiny homes. There's a single men and women who really don't need a lot of space. And I want to make the point here that we don't want to force anybody to live in tiny homes. There are some people who would think they can't think of anything worse than living in a 50 square metre or smaller dwelling. And we absolutely do not want anyone to be forced to living this way. But if only 1% of the population wanted to live tiny, goodness, what a difference that would make to if those people could live tiny and then leave the traditional dwellings for the people who don't want to live tiny.
Exactly. How does one cope with sewerage and electricity and whatever?
There are solutions, with technology and with solar power. If it is in someone's backyard, then you can often hook into all of those services. If it's on more land, then there's incinerating toilets, which are amazing.
Yes.
The modern composting toilets are amazing. If you can't hook into the system, you do need to treat...
A lot of people use them anyway, don't they?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. You do need to follow rules around grey water disposal, but everything else, there are solutions, and none of them are dead ends to saying that this shouldn't happen.
Exactly. Now, Ballina, after years of advocacy efforts, is now looking into encouraging tiny homes in appropriate areas as part of the future housing strategy that was adopted at the most recent Ballina Shire Council, I think, meeting. And Greens councillor, Kiri Dicker, has been clear supporter of this, noting that making it easier to live in tiny homes is appropriate circumstances. In one way, we can unlock instant supply of affordable housing for people on low and low other income. So, and I think Mount Alexander was one of the first council in Australia to directly welcome, and Shell Harbour City Council and whatever. How long before do you think Queensland backs something like this?
It's hard to tell. Definitely a lot. The Ballina one, for instance, because they have had the natural disasters down that area, I think that has really force the conversation.
Yes.
In Queensland, like I said before, Brisbane is okay with the precedences of living in tiny houses, but really it takes one person within a local government or within an area to champion the cause, and things could happen quite quickly.
Well, now when you look at the floods up north and whatever, there's going to be a tremendous amount of poor people that are out of their homes that have nowhere to live, aren't they?
And
yes.
tiny houses can be built so quickly. You know,
Yes.
they are manufactured housing, modular housing. That all fits within the Building Code of Australia for fixed housing. But with the same principles, tiny houses can be built in, 6 weeks or so, and could be rolled out and provide a solution, a temporary solution. Obviously, we've been talking now about permanent living in tiny houses, but emergency living in tiny houses is happening. It's happening already all over Australia. You don't see a lot of press because it is usually governments responding to emergencies, but they absolutely have lots of purposes in that area.
Exactly. How big does a tiny house have to be when it becomes no longer a tiny house? Is there a specific size that's regarded as a tiny house?
Well, different countries have different sizes, but we say under 50 square metres keeps it a tiny house. If it is on wheels, you need to think about the being able to fit on the road for transport. You get much bigger than that, and it really should be connected to the land and treated like a traditional house.
Exactly. Now, you've got a number of exhibitions coming up throughout Australia, in most of the capital cities and other towns. And I believe there's one scheduled for Toowoomba in May and then in Brisbane in October. Is that right?
Absolutely. Like I said before, the Tiny Home Expos aren't run by us, but we participate in them. So I think there's one in Mornington Peninsula. That might be the next one. And yes, there's one in Brisbane maybe in October. Adelaide, they're definitely talking about doing one in Perth. I think
and
there's
Melbourne
a lot of
and
demand.
Canberra.
Yes. So they're brilliant for looking at the tiny houses, seeing what all the different builders are doing, because there is such a range from the very basic, lowest affordable one to some amazing luxury ones with beautiful craftsman. Timber
like boats.
Cupboards. Oh, like boats.
Yes, that's right.
That's right.
And there's good and there's fabulous, or there's not so
Absolutely.
good.
And bringing up boats, I did want to point out that we do trust people to live on boats and look after their waste and make sure your drinking water is potable, and to use power. We allow people out in Moreton Bay here in Queensland to do that, and we trust them, but yet we don't do that with tiny houses, and I think we should.
Exactly, yes. The only thing I live on looking down over the Broadwater, and there are a number of boats that are left, unfortunately, derelict and are washed ashore. So it's something, at least with a tiny house,
they can be moved on.
Washed ashore. It can be moved on.
Yes.
So now tell me, to find out more about tiny houses, I think that people will just go on the tinyhouse.org.au, is that right? Or you can phone here at 4RPH Reading Radio, and we can put you in touch with Lauren. And then, as we have said, there's going to be the exhibitions, because it sounds as though there's going to be one in Toowoomba, in Brisbane, in Melbourne, Canberra, and you say Adelaide and Perth as well?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, so no matter where you're listening to Reading Radio, you should be able to pop in and have a look at one of the exhibitions, I should say.
Absolutely.
So, unfortunately, our time has come to an end, Lauren, because it's been fascinating, really fascinating talking to you about something that's really been very close to my heart. And I know particularly one of my grandsons who's a builder as well. And, it's been really, really wonderful. So thank you, Lauren Russell, Secretary of Australian Tiny Houses, for being our guest today.
Thank you.
And this chat has been recorded in the studios of Reading Radio in Brisbane for the Reading Radio Network, throughout Australia.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.